Project page next chapter. Prologue, Wilderness. It was deep into night, and it was pitch black everywhere. Nothing could be seen, however, it was not silent within the mountains. The roar of fierce beasts shook the mountains and rivers, and as countless trees trembled, leaves rustled and randomly fell. Between the groups of mountains and endless ravines, the fierce beasts ran wild within the flooded wilderness. Ancient remains appeared and disappeared, and various types of terrifying sounds rose up and down in the darkness as they split open the world. Within the mountain range, a lump of gentle light vaguely appeared as it looked from afar. It flickered like a candle in the endlessly dark curtains of the night within the 10,000 mountains, and it looked as if it was about to be extinguished at any time. As it gradually neared, one could clearly see that it was a huge half-dead tree. The diameter of the tree trunk was a dozen meters or so, and it was completely burnt black. Other than the main half-destroyed tree trunk, there was only a single weak branch left. However, it was still emitting life, and the sparkling and translucent leaf on the branch looked as though it was carved out of green jade, and dots of soft light spread as it enveloped a village. To be more precise, it was a tree that was struck by lightning. Many years ago, lightning that filled the sky passed by here, and the old and huge cover of the willow tree as well as its flourishing life was destroyed. At that moment, only a 9-meter-tall tree stump was left on the ground. It was frighteningly thick, and that single willow branch was like a divine chain as it released a green glow. A ring of light engulfed and guarded the entire village, and it caused the entire residential area to be blurry and hazy. As if it was a land full of saints, it was extremely mysterious within the wilderness. Within the village, all the houses were made out of stone. It was deep into the night, and so the villagers were silent. In that area, it was peaceful and tranquil, as if it was separated from the darkness and howls of beasts outside. Woo! A gust of wind blew past, and a huge black cloud flew by in the skies. It covered the entire black sky, and as it obstructed the tiny bit of light from the stars, the mountain range became even darker. A tyrannical bird cry rang out from the high skies, piercing through metal and splitting open rocks. It unexpectedly appeared from within the black cloud, and if one looked more carefully, one could see that it was an inconceivably huge bird. It covered the sky and the moon. No one could truly tell how long it was. It passed over this stone village, and it looked downwards. Its two eyes were like two blood moons, and its cruel atmosphere filled the skies. After staring at the old willow tree for a while, it decided to fly towards the deepest part of the mountain range. Silence ensued for a long period of time, continuing until past midnight. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and an unclear shadow walked over from the distance. It was as high as the group of mountains. An indescribable aura was emanated, and the group of mountains and countless ravines were as silent as death. The tyrannical birds and fierce beasts remained hidden, and they did not dare make a single sound. It came close. It was an organism that had the shape of a human. It walked upright, and it was terrifyingly huge. Its shoulders were comparable to the mountains, and there wasn't a single hair on its body. Golden-colored scales covered its body, and it was bright and dazzling. Its face was extremely flat, and only a pair of horizontal eyes rested on it. As they opened and closed, it was as if golden-colored lightning streaked past, and it was frightfully sharp. Its entire body's blood and chi were like an ocean, making it seem like a divine devil. It walked past that land and shot a glance towards that old willow tree. It stopped for a short while, then as if it was hurrying, it quickly disappeared far away. Many mountains and their peaks violently trembled from the vibrations of its footsteps. At dawn, a 10-meter-long centipede that was as thick as a bucket appeared. It was glittering with a silvery light as it wiggled and crawled within the mountains. It seemed as though it was cast out of white silver, and every single section was shiny and fierce. As it scratched past the mountain rocks, it created scraping sounds and caused sparks to fly. In the end, however, it avoided the stone village and it did not invade. The area that it went over churned with black mist, and all sorts of beasts stayed away. A single weak willow branch that emitted a lustrous green glow was lightly swaying in the wind. Project page next chapter. Previous chapter next chapter. Chapter 1 Full of Life. Stone Village was located within a vast mountain range. All around it were tall peaks and huge ravines, and endless groups of mountains towered over. The sunlight passed through the dyed clouds, and it scattered a golden radiance as the people warmly bathed within. Dozens of children gathered together in a group, and the ages varied from 4 years old to those over 10 years old. They faced the sunlight in an empty courtyard in front of the village, and were training their bodies with HMPH and Ha sounds. The young and tender little faces were all serious. The older children gave off a power like that of a tiger's, while the younger ones still practiced with good form and style. A middle-aged man with a body as well built as a tiger or leopard wore clothing made from beasts. The color of his skin was like copper, and his black hair was spread over his shoulders. His bright and lively eyes scanned over every single child, and he sternly gave out instructions. When the sun rises, all living things begin to move, and the air of life is the most vigorous at that time. Although we cannot take the sunlight as meals and eat air like in the legends, there are still great benefits by training oneself while facing the sun, as it can fill one's body with energy. A day's plan depends on the morning. Every day, rise early, and work hard. Strengthen your muscles, tendons, bones, and circulate your blood. You must do that to survive in this vast mountain range. The middle-aged man who stood at the front and instructed the group of children had a face of strictness. He seriously warned, then yelled, "Do you understand?" "We understand." The group of children had plenty of vitality as they loudly replied. There were many appearances of prehistoric life forms within the mountains. Occasionally, huge wings that covered the sky would pass over and cast giant shadows on the ground. There were also some desolate beasts who stood on mountain peaks, howling after swallowing the moon. Of course, the various types of poisonous insects moving about could not be forgotten, as they were also abnormally terrifying. "Understand," the little guy, who was clearly distracted and was half a beat slower, babyishly yelled out. It was a very young child, roughly 1 or 2 years old. After learning how to walk for barely a few months, he had already begun to train with everyone else. Obviously, he went over by himself and mixed himself along with the older children, and was clearly not supposed to appear in that group. HMPH ha hey. The little guy made sounds from his mouth, and his tender little hands tried their best to wave around. He tried to imitate the older children's movements, but he was too small and young. His movements were slanted and twisted, and his steps were unstable as he staggered around. In addition, there were white-colored milk stains on the corners of his mouth, making him appear quite foolish. A group of older children were looking at him, and all of them were moving their eyebrows and eyes, causing the atmosphere of the originally strict morning exercises to relax. The little guy was quite beautiful with his white and tender skin as well as his big, black revolving eyes. His entire body looked like a porcelain doll, causing him to look quite cute. His young and tender movement and the ya sounds coming from his mouth made him seem lovable and naive. Within another piece of land, some older people who sat cross-legged on huge rocks while breathing in and out also revealed smiles. Even the male adults who were robust and half-naked with shiny muscles also looked over with smiles. They were the strongest people in the village, and they were also the most important powers who hunted and guarded the village. They were also training. Someone held a big bone club from an unknown huge beast skeleton, and there was also another person who held a black-colored, metal-casted broadsword. He powerfully waved it, and the noise created from the wind was like thunder. Their living environment was extremely nasty, and because there were various floods, fierce beasts, poisonous insects, and difficulty in gathering food for survival, many males died in the wilderness before they even matured. If one wanted to live, they could only strengthen themselves and work hard in the morning. No matter if it was adults, or elders, or children, it was a habit that was formed since they were young. "Concentrate," the middle-aged man who was responsible for supervising and instructing the children's training loudly yelled. The group of children hurriedly went back to being serious, and they continued to train in the soft and dazzling morning sunlight. Tired, the little guy exhaled, then he sat down on the ground as he looked at the training of the older children. However, after a while, his attention shifted. He stood up, and while staggering, he rushed towards a 5-colored sparrow that was jumping and bouncing around nearby. At the end, it did not go well. He fell on his butt a few times, but he did not cry. As he huffed, he climbed back up to chase again with HMPHS and sighs. "Okay, stop." Following a loud shout, every single child cheered for a while. They massaged their aching hands and feet, then while shouting, they separated and charged towards their own homes to eat breakfast. The older villagers all smiled as they climbed down from the huge rocks. As for the adults who were as well built as tigers, they also laughed, and some of them followed their own children back home as they held their bone clubs and broadswords. Stone Village was not too big. There were around 300 people if you added up the old and young males and females. The houses were made out of huge stones, and they were plain and natural. At the front of the village, there was a huge tree which that had been struck by lightning, and it had a diameter of a dozen meters or so. At that moment, the light from the only willow branch remaining on the tree was already being concealed by the morning sunlight, and it became quite ordinary. "Oh, you have dirt dragon meat. Hand me some." Some children were lively and restless, and as they ate, they didn't have much etiquette. Many of them came out from their homes to gather together while hugging their pottery bowls. Grass and trees flourished around Stone Village, and although there were many fierce beasts, they had guards protecting them from the big mountain. The amount of food was not that abundant for the villagers. They only had some rough wheat bread, wild fruits, and rare meat in the children's bowls. In fact, insufficient food was always a very serious problem for Stone Village. The mountain range was extremely dangerous, and the abnormal beasts and fierce birds were too strong and terrifying. Every time they went out to hunt, it was possible that someone would lose their life. If there was a choice, the villagers would not be willing to enter the mountains, because entering the mountain indicated blood and sacrifices. To them, food was always extremely precious, and wasting was not allowed. Every single child were taught that since they were young. Hunger, food, hunting, life, blood, they were all interconnected. The courtyard of the old chief, Shi Wan Yunfeng, was located at the front of the village. It was pieced together by huge stones, then tightened up with huge burnt willow wood. Within the courtyard and in front of the kitchen, a white-colored liquid inside a pottery pot was boiling. The fragrance of the milk pounced towards one's nose, and the little guy was currently simmering milk from beasts. Other than that, occasionally, he threw some medical herbs in and slowly stirred it with a wooden ladle. After a short while, the old man yelled, "Little guy, come over and eat." The little guy lost his parents when he was half a year old, so he grew up by drinking the milk of beasts. At that moment, he was already 1 year and a few months old. If he was a normal child, he should have already weaned, yet he still drank the milk quite deliciously. He was unwilling to stop drinking the milk, so he was teased by some older children. "Yuya, I can't run anymore," he kept persistently chasing after the five-colored sparrow, and he was already out of breath. At that instant, he fell and sat on the floor. "Little guy, drink your milk," a bunch of older children clamored together. "You little monkeys, didn't all of you also pass through his age?" The old chief smiled and reprimanded them. "But we didn't still drink milk at the age of 1.5. Hee hee." The little guy made a silly smile as he faced the teasing of the older children. His big, bright, and black eyes squinted into a crescent moon and he didn't seem to mind. He sat in front of the pot and scooped with the wooden ladle, drinking the milk quite delightfully. After breakfast, several extremely aged old people in the village gathered in the courtyard of the chief, Shi Yunfeng. Although their hairs had all turned white, they were still very vigorous. "Something's wrong recently. Late last night, a giant creature passed by and created a massive disturbance. Something must have happened deep within the mountain range. I woke up from my sleep a few times last night, and my skin and bones were chilly. Undoubtedly, some cruel beasts or huge insects must have passed by." Several old people spoke one after another. They were either frowning or in deep contemplation. They discussed some hints of danger recently, and they felt that something different happened. "I feel that in the deep wilderness, something impressive must have appeared to attract the attention of the surrounding areas or ancient remains, so all of them quickly went over," said Chief Shi Yunfeng after thinking. "A mountain treasure wouldn't have appeared right." Another old person instantly widened his eyes. His hair and beard all stood up, and he expressed his surprise. Others also expressed unusual expressions and their gazes were burning, however, they quickly put out the flames in their eyes. Things like those were not something that they could get. No one would enter the deepest parts of the faraway mountain range. For all these years, not a single person was able to survive after entering such a place. All sorts of overpowering things appeared within the mountains, and even if every single person in Stone Village went in together, they wouldn't be able to accomplish anything. "Chief, we haven't entered the mountain in quite a few days." Just at that time, a powerful adult male walked into the courtyard. He was the leader of the hunting team, and he was also the chief who was going to serve Stone Village next. "It hasn't been too peaceful recently." Chief Shi Yunfeng furrowed his brows. "But there really isn't much food left," Shi Linhu said. His build was extremely tall and big, being over 2 meters tall. He carried a broadsword that weighed 300 jin or so, and his entire figure looked like a human-shaped bear. Chunks of copper-colored muscles were all over his body, and they were moving around like a python. "The little ones need to grow and they cannot starve. We must think of some methods," spoke an elder. "Although it isn't too peaceful and quiet at night here, on the other hand, there aren't many abnormalities in the day. I'll bring some people out, and there shouldn't be many problems if we are careful, Shi Linhu said. In the end, dozens of males at their prime gathered at the front of the village. The chief, Shi Yunfeng, brought them in front of the lightning-struck wood and seriously prayed towards the old willow tree. Guardian spirit, please protect my clan members, let them hunt some plump prey for the children, and safely return. With devout hearts, we offer sacrifices and offerings to you for generations to come. Previous chapter next chapter. She equals stone. Previous chapter next chapter. Chapter 2 bone text. Under the prayers of the chief and a few elders, all of the males revealed solemn expressions on their faces as they conducted worship. Many women and children also quickly rushed over, silently praying that the relatives who were about to go hunting would come back safely. The mountain range was simply too dangerous. It was a completely different world outside once one left the protection of the village and the willow tree. It was one filled with terrifying birds of prey and huge beasts. And just like that, the village's strongest group of individuals, carrying giant bows and broadswords on their backs, set off and entered the mountain valleys, creeks and huge lakes. Momentarily after, there was a large waft of a desolate smell. Watching as the hunting group left, the old chief Shi Yunfeng led the group of children towards the grass patch located at the entrance of the village. He sat cross-legged and said, "All right, you little group of monkeys need to sit down and study hard." The group of children immediately became distressed and all of them had dispirited expressions. They reluctantly sat down, as if they were wilted leaves. "Grandpa Chief, those bird languages and turtle writings are complicated like hobgoblin symbols. It's too hard to learn. What is the point of studying it?" "Exactly, it's not as useful as the archery my father taught me." The group of children all had sour expressions on their faces, and they all felt conflicted. "You group of little babies really don't know anything." The bone text consists of tyrannical symbols on bones that were passed down naturally by terrifying archaic descendants. Embedded within are mysterious forces in which many people could not learn even if they wanted to. Even if you are just somewhat successful in learning it, who knows how many times stronger you would be compared to your parents. The old chief criticized them for not meeting his expectations. "Grandpa Chief, demonstrate for us the power of this bone text," a slightly older child spoke. "Little guy, come here," the chief shouted from afar. The little guy had just finished chasing after the five-colored sparrow, and was currently putting a lot of energy into pulling a big yellow dog's tail. Turning his head in confusion, he released his grip and ran over while shaking his buttocks. Opening his big bright eyes, he said, "Yeah, Grandpa Chief, what do you need?" "I want you to use the things I taught you from the bone text," Shi Yunfeng said. "Okay." The little guy was very obedient, and stretched out his two little hands. He closed his mouth, and his entire body was constantly using energy, causing his little face to become red. With a wing sound, his palms emitted a bright light, and a strange character emerged. It looked like it was made out of casted metal, and it possessed a metallic luster. Soon after, it appeared on his other hand as well. The little guy walked up a few steps, and lifted up a boulder that was taller than him. "So powerful," exclaimed the group of children. This was the little guy who was a bit older than one. How could he possibly lift up such a big rock? "Little guy, did you use all of the strength you got from drinking milk?" The older kids all teased him. Yes, I used up all my strength." The little guy dropped the stone and sat his butt down on the floor and smiled without a hint of worry. He was extremely pure, and quickly, the characters faded from his palms. "Grandpa Chief, is this the power from that mysterious bone text that you studied for more than 10 years? The group of children's eyes were all shining, and their previous lack of interest no longer existed. "Don't get too excited, this can only be considered the basics. Compared to the heavenly bone text that appeared in legends, it is still too far off." The old man nodded, then shook his head. "Can Grandpa Chief tell us about the outside world?" The group of children had hopeful expressions. Everyone within the village knew that when the chief was younger, he left with roughly a dozen individuals for the distant Mother Earth's limits and explored the outer world. However, 10 years ago, only 2 managed to come back while drenched in blood. One of the 2 died soon after, and only Shi Yunfeng was able to survive. He spent these past years studying the bone text, and from time to time he would test it out on the strong individuals within the village. These kids all knew clearly that when their parents, who were like tigers and dragons, were called over, they would all make howls and shouts that made hearts tremble within the stone courtyard. This made these children feel worried, yet at the same time admiration. Only in recent years had the old chief's research gradually begun to lessen, no longer frightening the village's residents. Moreover, that little guy who drank the milk of wild beasts was raised by him, and he became his best research candidate. The outside world, the old man began to reminisce. After being spellbound with regret, he said, "The world is too big, it's vast and boundless. Just from one region to the next would cover millions of li. No one really knows how vast it was, as a person walking on foot would not completely cover a single region in their lifetime. It is simply boundless and desolate. Different regions' residents would find it extremely difficult to contact and communicate with each other because it is simply too dangerous. The land has too many different tyrannical beast species, and they are all formidable and mysterious. Regardless of whether it was a tribe of several 100,000 or a magnificent and enormous city, there was still a chance that they would be destroyed overnight by some ancient species. Of course, there were still humans who were unimaginably powerful and comparable to that of archaic descendants. They possessed matchless divine power, and these humans were the most gifted ones amongst the human race. The group of children all felt reverence within their hearts, and at the same time, they felt a sense of yearning as they were all curious about the outside world. Someone asked, "Within this land, are there any earthly gems or legendary elixirs that could enable one to undergo rebirth? Also, the human race's strongest geniuses, how strong are they exactly?" The old man laughed and said, "If you want to know, then you must first become strong. If we can master the bone text's mysterious power, would we be able to explore the regions under the sky?" Some of the children began to reveal their yearning. Shi Yunfeng petted a child's head before saying, "Not mentioning other regions, anyone able to travel across half of this region can already be considered incredible." All of the children were dumbstruck. "All I can do is guide you towards the correct path, however, where you end up in the end will depend on you. The things I have taught you should not be inferior to the things taught to children of similar ages in the outside world." When the old man finished what he was saying, his eyes revealed a different light, and he rubbed the exotic jade bone in his bosom. The group of children who sat in a circle around the old chief finally concentrated and began to focus on the lecture. Only at noon did they finally disperse. "It's too hard." Chief actually said that it required a few years for the bone text to slightly enter one's body. In addition, most people won't ever succeed at it, but that pea-sized little guy actually did it. The little guy innocently blinked his eyes, and then once again began to pull at the tail of that big yellow dog, and the big yellow dog began to bark innocently. The sun began to set in the west, and under the sunset's afterglow, the entire stone village was infected with a faint golden sheet of brilliance. In the distance, various apes and lions cried out, and a large number of stone houses at this moment were like divine ancient temples, holy and peaceful. Roughly a dozen people gathered at the horizon, and their shadows were being stretched out by the setting sun. Their bodies' outlines appeared golden within the sunset glow, making them appear incomparably tall and powerful. They were each dragging the head of an enormous and ferocious beast as they returned from their bountiful journeys. Their back, the village's women and children who stood at the village entrance waiting for a long time burst out in cheers, and the uneasiness and fear within their hearts vanished at once. They shouted in a loud voice. "Father and the others returned safe and sound. Heavens! To come back with so much prey. This time we reaped a rare and great harvest." The hunt this time was extremely successful, and the dozen grown men all returned with their good harvest. Within the prey was the enormous body of a dragon-horned elephant, which was a beast with excessive meat similar to that of a cow. Furthermore, the buckets were filled with thick and thin flying pythons. The old folk within the village all had shocked expressions on their faces. These beings were normally very hard to deal with, and some of them were even called fierce beasts. For so many of them to be hunted today and covered in blood, it was simply too unexpected. Take for example that dragon-horned elephant. The elephant's body was like that of metal, and it was difficult for even iron spears to pierce through. The pair of dragon horns were sharp like knives, easily splitting apart boulders. For that one-legged kui beast, if it managed to make its way up close, it could shock people straight to death. As for those flying pythons born with enormous wings, they were known as mountain killers. They would leave the mountain tops and abruptly dive down to kill, causing them to be extremely terrifying. Within the prey were some beings that were even more formidable, such as the scarlet-bodied two-headed flame rhinoceros, which was an impure-blooded mythical creature. These were all genuine fierce beasts. If they happened to meet one of them, they would normally take long detours to avoid them, and yet they were able to hunt them today, completely defying common sense. This time we really were extremely lucky to return from such a rewarding journey without a single casualty, laughed Shi Linghu, the leader of the hunting group, as he explained to the chief and villagers. During these past few nights, there were many supreme enormous beasts passing through the mountains, moving the earth and shaking the mountains. They trampled everything to death, and harmed many mountain beasts. During these past few days, many fierce beasts were hurt, and those heavily injured beasts were pursued and hunted by them, becoming easy prey. These were all tyrannical creatures that the village men would normally run away from. The enormous footprints within the mountains were similar to those of humans, but they were simply too huge, with each of them nearly 100 meters long. That large, exclaimed the village members. This really was shocking news. Even the elders who heard this could not help but draw in a breath of cold air. They were increasingly realizing that something happened within the mountain range abyss that ended up attracting the archaic descendants around the large desolate areas. In any case, it was a one-time plentiful harvest, and everyone was full of happiness. Stone Village was filled with the sound of children's laughter and the atmosphere was joyful. Chief Shi Yunfeng brought the group of people to the willow tree and brought the dozen dead enormous beasts to the stone platform that was clearly a large altar. Previous chapter. Next chapter. Li is a Chinese mile equivalent to roughly 500 meters. Previous chapter. Next chapter. Chapter 3. Guardian Spirit. The sacrificial platform was made from layers of huge rocks. It was quite wide, and its establishment neighbored the old and broken willow tree. Upon it lied a small mountain of fierce beasts. Sanguine beast blood dyed the large stone platform scarlet as it trickled along the engravings on the face of the stone. A brilliant red shone on the tough and long beast's fur, and cold light flickering on their scales malevolent horns as well. It was a horrifying scene that shook one's heart, and there was a bitter desolate air assaulting everyone's nostrils. Under the guidance of the old chief, Stone Village's residents all gathered to pray and request for the willow tree's protection. This was a solemn event of offering sacrifices, as well as a type of usual practice. This was carried out each time a hunt ended. The scorched black tree's body stayed just as quiet as before, as if it didn't react in the slightest. It never used the offerings as always, but some of the village residents knew that it actually had a spirit. Finally, the sacrificial procedures were finished. The villagers all released a large breath of air and once again happily smiled. They began to move the bodies of those fierce beasts in preparation of draining their blood and cutting them up. Many years have passed already, yet the guardian spirit hasn't moved once after our offerings. Do we still need to offer sacrifices every time? A youngster murmured in a low voice. You stinky brat, what kind of garbage are you spouting? His father's bronze eyes opened wide, and lifted his huge palm leaf hands to beat him. The old chief gestured with his hands and stopped him from doing so. In a soft voice, he said, "We have offered sacrifices towards this guardian spirit, and it has provided for us. Only by remembering it sincerely within our hearts and treating it piously would it guard, bless and protect our village." The youngster's face was completely red, and hurriedly replied, "Chief, it's not that my heart is not sincere. It's just that I think that the guardian spirit does not really need all of these offerings, as it has never moved or utilized them. As long as your intent is good, then that's enough." Shi Yunfeng patted his shoulders, and carefully explained. The guardian spirit was also called the Spirit of Sacrifice. It was an abbreviation for the tribe's Spirit of Sacrifice and Support. It protected the village, and it intimidated the great desolate area's vicious beasts, keeping them away. The village's elder still remembered that this same guardian spirit was not quite the same 10 years ago. There was instead a rather strange rock, and each time, the offerings would quickly lose more than half its blood essence from its absorption. One day deep into the night, however, the old willow came, and that block of stone decided to go far away, and everything completely changed after that. Thinking back to that rainy night, the old chief felt slightly distracted. That was when he was still a young youth, and at that time saw for himself that shocking and frightening scene. During that late night, lightning flashed and thunder roared, and the heavy rainstorm was majestic. The rainstorm was violent till its utmost limits, and the mountains were heavily battered by the thunder and lightning. The mountain torrent seemed like an ocean, and vicious beasts were running away frantically like the tides. The scene was terrifying. And right at that time, a large willow tree broke through the boundary of the heavens and appeared within the clouds. It bathed in the sea of thunder, and allowed the lighting from the mountains to course through itself. Tens of thousands of willow branches formed strips of burning divine chains and pierced into the heavens as if it was battling something. Finally, the large willow tree snapped, and its entire body was charred black. It was reduced to its current size before it fell down and took root within Stone Village. At that time, the lightning disappeared, and the downpour of torrential rain retreated. That night, the stone that the villagers sacrificed to and received supply from left. Every time he recalled this scene, the old chief would always feel his heart tremble. The old willow tree was not created from a random root within the mountains, but rather descended from the heavens. The reason it was damaged was due to the endless seas of thunder, and within the village, not many people knew about this. In its first 10 years, its entire body was scorched black and didn't have a single hint of life force. It appeared as if it was completely dead, and only 10 years ago did it finally show a single tender green branch. Since then, it has yet to undergo another change. Stinky brats, you all should be careful. We rarely reap such good harvests of vicious beasts. Their blood essence, muscles, vessels as well as parts of their bones are all extraordinarily precious, so don't waste their precious properties, the old chief warned. The villagers in their prime chopped with silver knives. While they were disassembling the giant creatures, there were sonorous sounds as sparks flew everywhere from hitting the giant creatures' shockingly hard skeletons. Someone had prepared a large jar long in advance to collect the special blood essence from within the beast's body. This was a refined blood medicine, extremely rare and precious. Among this pile of beast corpses, the most precious one was the Paishu one. Although it was just a descendant and was quite far from a pure-blooded Paishu king, it still possessed a portion of the true blood that had astonishing value. It has already been 2 years since they last caught a mythical beast type like the Paishu, as they were excessively savage and large. A single swipe from their claws would easily take the life of a strong individual, making them simply too horrifying to handle. One could say that the harvest this time was so luxurious it made them speechless. Woo, the true blood flowing from the two-headed flame rhinoceros's horn really is quite extraordinary. It's not inferior to the Paishu at all. An older grandpa personally used his knife to remove the rhinoceros horn from the flesh. It was as tough as metal and stone, and from that area dripped out a gush of scarlet-red true blood, making the carcass look like it was releasing fiery light. Suddenly, the blood unexpectedly changed into a clump of red radiance, and a palm-length two-headed flame rhinoceros appeared before everyone's eyes. Its entire body was scarlet red, and it was vivid and lifelike as it let out an angry roar. Good stuff. This true blood's medicinal qualities are extremely strong, and are not inferior to those of mythical beasts. The old grandpa who held the knife laughed heartily, and quickly utilized that jar to collect that rhinoceros blood before firmly closing the jar cover. Chief, this dragon-horned elephant's horn is also good stuff. When we found it, it was already close to dying. Otherwise we wouldn't have been able to handle it, a youth spoke. Shi Yunfeng nodded and said, it really is quite a rare sight. The dragon horn growing on its head has already matured. Once it is carefully extracted, it can be used as a precious medicine that can repair bones. The one-legged demon beast's leg has really tough and durable strips of muscles. Even axes cannot chop through it. This is all good stuff. You stinky youngsters need to be careful. Don't let the precious blood from the flying python's 2 wings go to waste. The villagers were all happy, and their faces were full of smiles. Only the children withdrew their necks before quickly disappearing. They knew that the majority of these blood and bone medicines would be used on their bodies, causing them to once again need to suffer. Only after an entire half-day passed did the precious treasure growing from the fierce beasts' bodies get plucked clean. The chief as well as several other elders nodded their heads in satisfaction before collecting the jars and storing them. There is so much prey. In a little while, we should preserve a portion, and afterwards smoke them and make it into meat jerky, some of the experienced elders were saying. With the fierce beasts piled up like a small mountain, the villagers could not finish it even after many days. If they simply allowed it to rot, then it would be too much of a waste. For the villages that have faced food shortages, there was no way they would permit that. The women from each of the households came up to divide the meat. All of them had sincere smiles on their faces, since previously they felt anxious with all the men outside. Now that they all returned peacefully and with such a luxurious harvest, it was truly one of heaven's best gifts. Smoke rose in spirals from the household's chimneys, and after half an hour, the fragrant smell of meat began to spread. The household's iron pots had almost finished stewing the meat chunks until they were soft, and the children couldn't wait any longer. In addition, the beast meat roasting atop the bonfires were also beginning to develop a golden and oily luster, and as the oil dripped onto the fire, sputtering noises were created. Those sturdy men all could not hold themselves back any longer, and began to tear off strips of meat. With big appetites, they bit into the meat, releasing a mouthful of juices. Small child, this is paishu meat. Eating a lot of it will give you big strength. It's truly a rare type of meat. Stinky youngster, eat more. This is meat from the two-headed flame rhinoceros. Eating more of it can help your skin and bone become tough like iron, so stop eating that useless tree pig meat. All types of different fierce beasts made up the villagers' rich evening meal. The enticing meat fragrance wafted through the streets, drawing in the appetites of the residents as waves of merry laughter rang throughout the festive village. Previous chapter. Next chapter. Paishu. https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/pixiu. Previous chapter. Next chapter. Chapter 4 Medicinal Bath. In this cruel great desolate era where fierce beasts rampage about and life is always under constant threat, the villagers' needs were rather simple. All they wanted was enough food to satisfy everyone's stomachs. The bonfire was jumping about, and Stone Village was currently bustling with noise and excitement. Males and females, both young and old, all had smiles on their faces. They were all filled with cheer while talking and laughing. Little children, don't run about carelessly. We are about to conduct the medicinal bath soon. Sleep well at night, and in the future you would definitely be stronger than all of the vicious beasts, said an elder while laughing. Ah, I don't want to. The group of kids who heard this all stood up and screamed miserably, running away and hiding within different parts of the village. You bunch of melon babies, you really do not know what is good fortune. These are rare tonics. If we could have this medicinal bath continuously, your muscles and bones would be able to match that of those giant creatures. The adults all criticized them, and like grabbing little chicks, they began to catch their children. It hurts, I don't want to go into the medicinal bath. Last time, it felt like I was getting cut by blades. Dad, let go, I don't want to be boiled. The group of children intensely resisted, but their small arms were no match for the adults' strength. In the end, they all were caught. Inside of an empty space within the village, 8 large copper cauldrons had been previously set up. The inferno below them raged, and the liquid within the cauldron was boiling. Several elders threw stock after stock of medicinal herbs inside, and from time to time, they would also put in foot-long centipedes and fist-sized spiders. This made the originally clear liquid dark and cloudy as if it was ink. It was extremely frightening. The faces of the group of children all turned green. They all wanted to escape and run away, but they were all helplessly held in place by the adults. Soon after, a few villagers arrived with 10 jars. Several elders gently and carefully opened them before pouring the dark red liquid into the large copper cauldrons, causing the dark black liquid to boil even more furiously. This was the scarce true blood from the slain vicious beasts' bodies. It was extremely precious, and regardless of whether it was an adult or a child using it, they would all gain tremendous benefits, enhancing their physiques. In addition, with the villagers' understanding of several ancient prescriptions, as well as adding some medicinal herbs etc., this true blood could become even more effective. Besides the true blood, several elders also used the flying python's wing bones, the one-legged beast's foot bone, as well as several other materials and pulverized them with a great deal of effort before tossing them into the boiling water. When the fire died out and the cauldron's contents no longer boiled, the water temperature finally somewhat dropped in temperature. Screams along with putong sounds rang out as the first batch of kids were thrown inside, and each cauldron held roughly 2 or 3 individuals. It hurts, this water can completely cook us alive. Save me, my body feels like it's being cut by blades, and my skin and flesh are being split open. They were all grimacing in pain, and their hands grabbing their legs. One by one they all rushed for the outside, only to be pushed back inside as they endlessly screamed. In this way, the several dozen kids were thrown in batches into the cauldrons. The majority viciously howled, and struggled constantly. Only 7 or 8 kids were somewhat better, and although they were aching and their brows were soaked in sweat, they endured it and didn't utter a single word. As for the little guy, he couldn't escape either and was thrown into a cauldron with special treatment by himself. Only a little bit of clear water was added to the cauldron, but other than that, all of it was true blood and broken down bones. The villagers did not feel that this was inappropriate, and did not feel that they were favoring him over others either. This was because their own children already couldn't withstand the pain and were crying out heart-tearing screams inside the normal medicinal cauldron, but this little guy could actually handle it. In addition, when the little guy was within the black cauldron's thick and boiling liquid, the old chief even opened up 2 special jars, and poured the contents into the cauldron. Pouring out of one of the jars was a scarlet cloud that formed a palm-sized pie shoe. It was mighty and malevolent, as if it was about to tear everyone apart and escape, and its nature was extremely vicious. From within Shi Yunfeng's palms shone a character, and the bone text began to rise. A slap made the pie shoe scatter and turn into blood, and it dripped into the cauldron. From that other jar rushed out a scarlet-red 2-headed flame rhinoceros. It was terrifyingly brilliant, and with its head high it angrily hissed, and was similarly released into the black cauldron by the old chief. When the temperature slightly dropped, the little guy was picked up and directly thrown into the cauldron while struggling. Because he was still little, he would choke on the water when sitting inside, so just as he fell inside with a gudong sounds, he immediately drank several mouthfuls of the liquid. The other children all showed sympathetic expressions towards him and suddenly felt quite fortunate. There was only a little water added, and the main portion was the special true blood, beast bone as well as muscle lumps that formed the medicinal liquid. This medicinal liquid would definitely make one's skin and bones feel even more pain. The little guy was truly pitiful. Even some adults couldn't bear it. The little guy was exerting as much strength as he could muster while struggling and grimacing in pain, and from time to time, he would even drink mouthfuls of the viscous fluid. The adults watching really began to feel quite worried. There's no problem since it's not his first time. Since he could do this before, then he could live past this as well. Drinking more of the medicinal liquid is not bad either. If he can absorb it, it'll allow him to absorb great benefits. The old chief spoke, as his care for the little guy's health was quite expansive. His constitution is quite strong, and the bone text's mysterious power might also be at work here by helping him refine part of the medicinal strength. The little guy should not feel that much pain. Another elder spoke while stroking his beard. The medicinal bath continued for quite a while, and the group of children were soaked until they looked like red monkeys. All of them looked rather miserable, and while looking at each other, tears dripped down with wah-wah sounds. Only when the medicinal bath finished did they stop sobbing and finally feel relief. While within the black cauldron, the little guy did not cry. His big eyes were looking around, and his face had a bit of a red blush, resembling a big apple. When he was lifted out, he looked as if he was drunk, swaying back and forth. "How do you feel?" an elder asked. The little guy burped, and said muddle-headedly, "I drank a lot, full now." Hearing this kind of simple-minded and pure response, the adults were all provoked into laughter. Tired, the little guy staggered from side to side, and his little body fell into Shi Yunfeng's embrace. He lightly mumbled something and slightly squeaked before sinking into deep sleep. "Bring these children back and let them sleep well. By tomorrow, their strength should have increased by a significant amount," said Chief Shi Yunfeng. Finally, several elders put away the leftover liquid. They didn't let it go to waste, but rather once again lit up the copper cauldron with fire and added some more medicinal herbs. They were going to cook until the medicine dried up and became medicinal power. Not only was this a type of tonic, but it was also a type of precious healing medicine. Bringing it along for the mountain range hunts could save lives. With vile environments and difficult to hunt magical beasts, true blood really was rare and precious. They couldn't afford to dispose such precious medicinal powder even after it was used by the children, and weren't willing to waste any of it at all. Naturally, the strongest villagers all didn't care about this, since as long as it could close up a wound and save their lives, it was enough. That night, all the children slept deeply. The next morning, many of these little guys were crying out loudly, as the old skin was being shed off in chunks, making their beds filthy. "Go, get a bucket of water and wash yourselves clean. Afterwards, lift that lump of millstone." "Dad, that is what third brother uses to train his strength. How could I possibly lift that up?" "Stop speaking nonsense. If I tell you to lift, then just lift. Are you telling me that we wasted all that true blood and bone medicine last night for nothing? If you really didn't make any progress, then I'll spank your butt until it turns into 8 fragments. Early the next morning, Stone Village was active like birds flying and dogs jumping. All of the children were forced to move large rocks and copper cauldrons as they whined repeatedly. The results were clearly obvious. The children all gained a significant amount of strength, and their physiques revealed an increase in power. However, if one were to say that they were reborn, then that was still a bit far from reality. Kacha kacha. The village head, Chief Shi Yunfeng's palm symbol glowed a brilliant light, and within his hand was the shaft of an golden alloyed hammer. With it, he smashed the most precious part of the dragon-horned elephant's dragon horn into pieces. Following that, he retrieved a portion of the Pyxiu's amputated claw bone as well as a small section of the flame rhinoceros' red horn, and similarly pulverized them until they became fine powder. He then mixed these crushed bone powders with several fierce beasts' true blood, and put them together into the slow-cooking beast milk. At that moment, the fragrance began to rise in spirals. Afterwards, the elder threw in stock after stock of medicinal herbs. Soon after, the liquid within the pot became muddled, and the fragrance became even richer. Time to eat, little guy. Within the stone house, the little guy heard the yell, and with a gulu sound, he turned around and then stood up. His eyes that had just woke up were still blurry, but as the fragrance leaked in, he quickly took a quick whiff. He immediately felt excited, and began muttering in that direction. Smells really good. Of course, this is genuine precious medicine, so don't waste any of it and eat all of it. Shi Yunfeng laughed and said. The little guy consumed it like a wolf, and before long, the pot's kanji was completely gone. However, the negative consequences immediately appeared since he really was too small, and the medicinal strength was too strong. In this ordinary morning, the adorable little guy suddenly began to act like a problem child. His 2 eyes turned red like a white rabbit, and he began to run all over the place, shouting "Ah-ya" non-stop. The pitiable large yellow dog's tail was once again grabbed by him, and was continuously being pulled. The tail was almost pulled off, and it howled with tears for half a day. It disturbed all the villagers and caused chaos. "Way, little guy, why are you pulling up my brother's wife's fence? What happened to the little guy? Why did he run up to my family's roof? Quickly, stop, don't tear off the tiles." The villagers were all stunned. The ordinarily extremely obedient little guy transformed into a little vicious beast. He ran all over the place as he wreaked havoc while using all of his strength. The pot of medicine was completely absorbed, and the results are not bad. Shi Yunfeng and several other elders were standing together, and they were currently quietly commenting, nodding their heads in satisfaction. In the distance, many children saw the scene in front of them and became even more frightful of the chief. All of them were quivering and trembling as they stayed far away. Gathering together, they muttered in a low voice, "The little guy is really pitiful." The little guy's palms shone and he lifted them up towards the sky. From those small arms appeared the bone text, and it flickered continuously. It was truly quite mysterious. In addition, his physique got stronger, and his speed and power were both promoted by a large margin as well. This was also the reason why the old chief was so satisfied. Only after 2 hours did he finally quiet down. He scratched his head in a daze, and said in a low voice, "Yeah, I'm in trouble.